This is Algebra 2, Unit 8, Lesson 6 on the quadratic formula. Now, back in Algebra 1, we did solving by completing the square and using the square root. So let's take a look at reviewing that for a second. Solve the following quadratic equations for all values of x by first completing the square on the quadratic expression. Express your answers in simplest radical form. Okay, so by completing the square, we have to get a perfect square. So we have to move the 1 over here to the other side. So that gives me x squared minus 6x equals -1. All right, now when completing the square, you take half of the b value, which in this case would be -6, and square it and add it to both sides. So that would be x squared minus 6x, and half of b would be, half of -6 would have to be -3 squared, and add it to the other side. And that gives me x squared minus 6x plus 9 is equal to -1 plus 9. Okay, now this can be factored as x minus 3 times x minus 3 equals -1 plus 9 is 8. So this actually becomes x minus 3 quantity squared is equal to 8. Okay, now from the previous lessons we've learned, with the square root, we can square both sides. Well, if we have a square here, remember you can take the square root of both sides. Okay, but just remember when you take the square root of both sides, there are two answers. It's going to be plus or minus 8. Plus or minus the square root of 8, I should say. So the square root of x minus 3 squared is x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. Add the 3 to both sides. 3 plus or minus the square root of 8. The square root of 8 will break down into 4 times 2, which is 2 times the square root of 2. So x will equal 3 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 2. Now remember, this is really two answers. This is 3 plus the square root of 2, and it's also 3 minus the square root of 2. The plus or minus actually means there's two values there. Okay, now why am I doing this? Well, this leads up to where the quadratic formula comes from. Now, since any quadratic can be rearranged through the process of completing the square, a formula can be developed that will solve for the roots of any quadratic equation. This famous formula, known as the quadratic formula, is shown below. We used it in Algebra 1. Basically, what they're saying is, if you have a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, as long as a isn't equal to 0, if you use completing the square on this and solved it for x, you would end up with this. That's where the formula comes from. There are many places online that you can look at actually the derivation, but take my word for it, this comes from completing the square on this. Okay, now, using the quadratic formula shown above, solve the equation from exercise 1. Now remember, exercise 1 was x squared minus 6x plus 1 is equal to 0. So first of all, it's in descending order, it's equal to 0. And we have to know what the a, b, and c values are. So remember, the a value is in front of the x squared, so this is really 1. The b value is -6. The c value is 1. So following your formula here, x is equal to -b would be, if it's already -6, this is going to be +6. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, -6 squared, minus 4 times 1 times 1, all over 2 times 1. So all I'm plugging in is the a, b's, and c values. Okay, now, the stuff that is under the square root, you can put in your calculator all at once, but use your parentheses because of the -6 squared. You have to make sure that that squares as well. So it would be parenthesis, -6 quantity squared, minus 4 times 1 times 1. You could probably even do that in your head, really. So this comes out to be 32. So if I go back to here, this is going to be 6 plus or minus the square root of 32 all over 2. All right, now I want to simplify the square root of 32. This is going to be x is equal to 6 plus or minus, the perfect square that goes into 32 is 16. So it's 16 times 2 all over 2. 6 plus or minus the square root of 16 is 4, radical 2, all over 2. Now this 2 actually divides both the 6 and the 4 because they're both real numbers. 6 over 2 are rational numbers, I should say. 4 over 2, square root of 2, and that will simplify. 6 over 2 is 3, plus or minus 2 radical 2. We got the same answer. Look at that. So the quadratic formula can be used on any quadratic equation. All right, you just have to rearrange it so it's equal to 0, and then you can plug in your a, b, and c value. All right, so let's use the quadratic equation. Which of the following represents the solutions to the equation x squared minus 10x plus 20 is equal to 0? Okay, now notice this doesn't factor, so we have to use the quadratic formula. We need to know our a, b, and c value. Our a value, first of all, is this in descending order, highest exponent first, equal to 0? Yes, it is. So our a value is going to be 1, b is going to be negative 10, and c is going to be 20. So plugging in your values, x equals negative b would be positive 10, b squared would be negative 10 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20, all over 2 times 1. All right, so I'm going to do this in the calculator. I'm going to make sure my parentheses are around my negative 10. So parenthesis, negative 10 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20. Make sure everything that you plugged in is in parentheses so it goes in correctly, is equal to 20. So going back here, x is equal to 10 plus or minus the square root of 20 all over 2. All right, now remember the square root of 20 has what perfect square in it? Well, it's 4 times 5. 4 is the perfect square divided by 2. So this is 10 plus or minus 2 radical 5 all over 2. And the 10 is divided by the 2 as well as the 2 radical 5 is divided by 2. So this is going to be 5 plus or minus radical 5. So that means this is going to be number 4. Although the quadratic formula is most helpful when a quadratic equation is prime, which means not factorable, it can be used as a replacement for the zero product law in cases where the quadratic can be factored. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to solve this by factoring and by using the quadratic formula, and we will get the same answer. All right, so if we have 2x squared plus 11x minus 6 equals 0, we're going to solve it by factoring. We can use double bubbles or the box method. This is going to be 2x times x, because 2x squared. Now to get 6, we can use 6 and 1 or 3 and 2, and whatever goes here is multiplied by 2. All right, so I believe I'm going to use 6 and 1. All right, now to get this to be positive 11, this would have to be plus 6 and minus 1, because that gives me 12 minus 1 is 11. All right, set your factors equal to 0. Solve for x. 2x is equal to 1, so x is equal to a half, and x is equal to negative 6. So there are my two solutions that I got by factoring. Now, can I use the quadratic formula? Of course I can. All right, my a value on this one is going to be 2, b is going to be 11, c is going to be negative 6. All right, so using my formula, x equals negative b would be negative 11, plus or minus the square root of b squared, 11 squared, minus 4 times 2, which is a, times c, which is negative 6, all over 2 times 2. All right, I'm going to put this in my calculator. (11 squared) minus 4 times 2 times negative 6. And I end up with 169 all over 4. All right, now I know 169 is a perfect square. The square root of 169, if you want to work it out, the square root of 169, I'm just going up and grabbing it, is 13. So if I go back here, it's negative 11 plus or minus 13 all over 4. Now remember, as I said before, this is actually two answers. This is x equals negative 11 plus 13 over 4, and it's x equals negative 11 minus 13 over 4. All right, negative 11 plus 13 over 4 is 2/4, which is a half. So x equals a half. That's what we got over here. Negative 11 minus 13 is negative 24 over 4, which is equal to negative 6. So you can see I got the same answers by factoring of the quadratic formula. Rule of thumb, if you can factor it, factor it. If you can't factor it, use the quadratic formula. Usually factoring is faster if you can do it. But if it's a bigger factor, use the quadratic formula. Alright, so the quadratic formula is very useful. We can use it on any quadratic, whether it's factorable or not. So let's solve each of the following using the quadratic formula. Some will be rational and some will be irrational numbers. So place all answers in simplest form. Okay, quadratic formula. A value will be 3, B will be 5, C will be 2. Okay, so x equals negative b would be negative 5 plus or minus the square root of b squared, 5 squared, minus 4 times 3 times 2, 4a times c, all over 2 times a, which is 2 times 3. Negative 5 plus or minus, all right, I'm going to put this whole thing in my calculator, 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times 2. And notice I'm using a parentheses again, which is 1. Okay, so 5 plus or minus the square root of 1 over 2 times 3 is 6. So this is negative 5 plus or minus, what's the square root of 1? Is 1 over 6. Now remember, again, this is two answers. X equals negative 5 plus 1 over 6. X equals negative 5 minus 1 over 6. Negative 5 plus 1 is 4 over 6 is 2/3. So x equals 2/3. Negative 5 minus 1 is negative 6 over 6 is negative 1. So since these came out to be rational numbers, this tells me that this could have been factored. So if you weren't sure about factoring it, it will factor as 2/3 and actually should be negative 2/3 because it's negative 4. Negative 2/3 and negative 1. Okay. All right, let's try this one. X squared minus 8x plus 13 is equal to 0. A value is going to be 1 because that's the number in front here. B is going to be negative 8. C is going to be 13. X equals negative b. Well, this is already negative, so it's going to be positive 8 plus or minus the square root of b squared, negative 8 squared, minus 4 times a is 1 times c is 13, all over 2a is 2 times 1. All right, 8 plus or minus. This is going in my calculator. Parenthesis, negative 8. Make sure it's in parentheses because it's going to screw up your negative otherwise. Minus 4 times 1 times 13. Close your parentheses. So that looks exactly like what's on my paper, is 12. So going back here, this is plus or minus the square root of 12 over 2 times 1 is 2. All right, so I need to simplify the square root of 12. What perfect square goes into 12? Would be 4. So it's 4 times 3 is 12. So x is equal to 8 plus or minus 2 radical 3 over 2. Now this 2 will divide both terms. So 2 over 2 radical 3. So 8 over 2 is 4 plus or minus 2 radical 3 over 2. 2 over 2 will reduce to 1, so this is 4 plus or minus radical 3. So remember again, there's two answers. X equals 4 plus radical 3 and x equals 4 minus radical 3. Okay, why don't you try the last two on your own and see what you get. I will tell you one of them is rational and one of them is irrational.